I think we should
Get
get
underway.
started.
Yeah. Give it just 1 second to get going, and I'll tell you to take it away. Go ahead, Paul.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone to this evening's War Industry Resistors Network Forum. Just quickly, I want to give you a quick reminder that our November forum will be on direct action at war industry facilities with Lisa Savage. And Brian, do we have any link to put in the chat so people could register for that later on?
I'll pop it in the chat for everyone, and then we'll also send it in a follow-up email, so you'll get a chance to join us.
Yeah, so keep that in mind. It should be interesting since so much is going on at these war manufacturers' sites, the factories and facilities these days. I'll mention that unfortunately, Ken Jones, that you're used to seeing, can't be with us this evening as he lives in Asheville, North Carolina, and is working with his neighbors to help each other in dealing with the devastation and trauma brought to his town by Hurricane Helene. So we wish Ken and Melanie well as they go through this period of recovery. And we send our condolences, of course, to all those people out there in Western North Carolina that are just going through hell right now. We'll have a quick announcement about how people can help out a little bit later on. So let us begin. Most of us know that our country has 900 military bases in more than 90 countries and territories. But let that fact sink in for a minute. 900. And many of us are aware of how many billions of dollars have been taken from the welfare of people in this country to sustain that military base empire, in addition to the environmental damage that these bases create wherever they exist. And just imagine the ear-piercing noise pollution coming from planes and helicopters taking off and landing all day at many of these bases. And of course, these foreign bases are being used constantly to launch disastrous wars, most recently in Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, Somalia, Libya. These bases are central to these interventions, as for instance, as our bases in Okinawa, the Philippines, and Thailand were essential to our destruction of large parts of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia decades ago. And as most of you know, David Swanson is a leader in the U.S. peace movement. Tonight, he will address the impact of the United States military base empire and how to resist it, including a report back on the highlights and strategies shared from World Beyond War's annual No War 2024 conference on this topic. As some of you know, David is co-founder, executive director, and a board member of World Beyond War, a global nonviolent movement to end war and establish a just and sustainable peace. World Beyond War is a nonprofit organization with chapters around the world, using educational, activist, and media work to advance the cause of ending all war and establishing lasting peace. That's not all. David is an author, activist, journalist, and radio host. He is campaign coordinator for rootsaction.org. His books include War is a Lie. He blogs at davidswanson.org and at warisacrime.org. He hosts Talk World Radio. David is a Nobel Peace Prize nominee and was awarded the 2018 Peace Prize by the U.S. Peace Memorial Foundation. He does it all the time. Welcome, David, and thank you for being with us this evening.
Thank you very much. I very much hope I can make it to that forum next month. That's a good one. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks to Massachusetts Peace Action. Thanks to Brian Garvey. Thanks to Paul Shannon. I think we saw each other at a No to NATO event last, if I remember right.
That's right.
We can talk about NATO if people want to. Thanks to the War Industry Resistors Network. Thanks to Ken Jones and everyone else. We every year, World Beyond War and International Peace Bureau do a 24-hour peace wave with people doing things in different places around the globe for 24 hours. And Ken is always on there with a crowd of people walking around Asheville. And I wonder what those locations look like now. Our thoughts should be with Ken and with everyone in Asheville and those who fled Western North Carolina and Florida. My thoughts are in particular with the guy in Florida who grilled up a final slab of meat, jumped in his enormous SUV, cranked up the air conditioning, and jumped on TikTok to complain that someone is, quote, controlling the weather. Some observers recognize the sad irony. Fewer recognize it in a different case. People in the United States, with the majority of their taxes going to wars and an empire of permanent war preparation, without whose largesse there could be no wars in Afghanistan or Iraq or Yemen or Libya or Palestine or Ukraine, are upset that the refugees from the wars want homes and are enraged that the US government doesn't better fund disaster relief in the United States. But if people knew how much money we're talking about, they would know that it could transform the lives of people in the United States and abroad, that there is no need for this bring the war dollars home selfishness. The earth is our home, and we need to turn the war dollars into peace dollars. I'm going to try and share slides, and you all tell me if you can see them okay.
Looking good.
See him, David.
I'm trying to show just one slide. Okay, I think it's working. See if I can make this work. I'm going to try and be brief and then be long on answering questions. I'm going to talk about closing foreign military bases. The United States, of course, has hundreds of military bases in the United States as well. The empire of bases costs some hundreds of billions of dollars from the US government each year, depending on what ships, planes, fuel, personnel, and wars and destruction you include, plus expenses from the occupied governments. They prefer to be called host governments, of course, and the lost gains, economic as well as moral, that could have come from putting that money to good use. The money the U.S. denies to the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinians, for example, is about 1% what it spends on its foreign bases. At World Beyond War, we have just held our annual conference called No War 2024. We held it at real-world locations in Australia, Germany, Colombia, and the United States, with the whole thing on Zoom. You can go watch the whole thing at worldbeyondwar.org/No War 2024. And you can watch it in half the time if you put the YouTubes on double speed. World Beyond War works with our chapters, our affiliates, and friends around the world on campaigns against bases, among many other educational and activist campaigns. and we work globally to provide resources to these campaigns. The headquarters for getting informed and getting involved is worldbeyondwar.org/bases. The leader of our closed bases work is our board member, Robert Fantina. During No War 2024, we heard a lot about the damage foreign bases do and the good work people do to prevent them or close them. From Australia, we heard from people who, like people in at least 85 other places, are sick and tired of being treated as the so-called 51st state. This treatment of others by the US government as it sets up bases in their land and won't even tell them what is there and won't even tell them whether nuclear weapons are or will be there, tend to generate either pathetic subservience or proud nationalistic resistance. Of course, we need more power at the global and local levels and will sooner or later die of nationalism. But this is just one of a great many negative impacts of bases. From Germany, we heard from people involved in numerous campaigns, past and current, including in Eastern Europe, where the war in Ukraine dominates concerns. From Sinjevina in Montenegro, we heard from people who have just successfully prevented the destruction of their mountains for a NATO military training ground. From the Czech Republic, we heard from a key participant in the campaign during the first decade of this century that prevented the creation of a planned US military base. From Colombia, we heard from people involved in the successful prevention of the creation of a military base on Providencia Island and the current effort to prevent one on Gorgona Island, both reportedly proposed in collaboration with the US military. We also heard from people who successfully closed bases in Puerto Rico and in places where the bases are coming back or threatening to come back, the Philippines and Ecuador. From Washington, D.C., we tried to provide a view out of the heart of the empire, including a panel on the environmental damage that these bases do around the world and how the U.S. military denies the so-called host countries the ability to even learn what it is doing to their water and soil. I'm going to review a little what I presented in Washington, D.C., focusing on online resources that World Beyond War provides people. One resource you'll find on the website, worldbeyondwar.org/bases, is called Military Empires. This is a visual guide to foreign bases. One thing you can do with it is spin a globe and click on a particular one of what are currently 917 US bases outside the United States. When you do, the map will zoom in on a satellite image of the base and provide information and links about the base and the damage it does and who is doing what to get it shut down and converted into something useful and the land cleaned up and put to better use and possibly restored to those from whom it was stolen. As only a small percentage of people in the United States know or care to find out, US bases are on land stolen from Hawaiians, from Aleutian Islanders, the people of several Pacific atolls, Okinawans, Inuits, Chagosians, Koreans, Palestinians, and until those bases were closed, the people of Vieques and Culebra, among others. In the US, we often hear about the danger to the world of Russia stealing land, even as the US arms Israel to shoot little children in the head to steal their land. And many a US academic tome will tell you that the United States has not taken anyone else's land since it finished its genocidal continental so-called settling. But bases tell a different story. Of course, we are constantly updating these maps and depend on help from all of you for updates and corrections. The research for these maps is put together by Mohammed Abunahel and the maps created by Mark Elliott Stein. Another resource you'll find is called Mapping Militarism, and this is a collection of maps of all things militaristic that includes, among much else, a map that color codes countries based on how many US military bases they have. Clicking on each country gives you the details. Another map gives you the number of US troops present. Other maps display NATO members and partners, where US wars have been waged, where the US government is applying sanctions. Together, these maps paint a picture that can be of nothing other than an empire, very poorly understood by most of the people who pay for it and in whose name it's created. You will also find a series of links to particular campaigns that some of our chapters are working on to close or to prevent particular bases, and to the successful campaign to prevent the construction of a military training ground in Sinyevina, which you know all about if you participated in No War 2024. We hope to work with all interested parties and add more to these campaigns. When you examine the 917 US foreign bases, I think you will come to the following conclusion. These things are catastrophic. They heighten tensions, they facilitate wars, they encourage militarism, they provoke terrorism, they endanger the host countries, they proliferate nuclear weapons and weapons in general, they support repressive governments, they cause irreparable environmental damage, they cause pollution. We will hear a bit about some of that shortly. They cost, this comment about what we will hear shortly was meant for the No War 2024 conference, but today I heard from Pat Elder, who many of you will know, who has a website at militarypoisons.org, who can tell you a great deal about his latest research into US military bases, including in Japan, that are polluting the whole place with the PFAS forever chemicals. And just about nobody knows or cares or is able to know or is doing anything. But Pat had a big impact on the media in Japan, and they're starting to wake up to the problem. Continuing the list of evils, the bases cost an exorbitant amount of money. They deny land to indigenous populations. They cause economic problems for the occupied countries. They station troops who commit crimes and who are given immunity for those crimes. They give a foreign nation influence. They establish mini apartheid states. This is something that I've been thinking about since reading the terrific books by David Vine, who I hope all of you also know. I don't think anyone has ever done a serious study of it, but I cannot imagine that there is no impact on how US occupiers of these bases think and act when they get back to the United States, given that many of these bases employ different looking and speaking local residents to do the menial jobs on the bases while living off the bases with a very different social, economic, and legal status. Since No War 2024 happened, I've just started reading a book called Suburban Empire by Lauren Hirschberg that seems to address this topic well with regard to the islands of the South Pacific, where the United States stole land to test nuclear weapons, ruined land forever, but also occupied land and established segregated castes. When you click on a particular base, you get more information about it. For those where we have been able to document the information, these bases tend to be very unpopular locally. Even in that minority of places where people fear some other empire might replace the US empire, their desire is most commonly to be subject to no empires at all. Needless to say, virtually no one in the United States or even the United States government could, without consulting our website, tell you where all the bases are. The US public has never been asked to vote on the general idea or any particular base. If there were suddenly 916 instead of 917, nobody would care, except perhaps the people who live near it. Leftists who want to invest in peace and climate and healthcare and housing oppose this madness. And right-wingers who want to pretend that the world outside the United States doesn't exist at all or who oppose spending money on anything, regardless of its merits or lack thereof, oppose it too. Even top officials within the US military believe that technology has rendered the empire of bases, or at least much of it, pointless for the project of being able to quickly wage war anywhere on Earth. And yet the bases persist and even expand as tools of imposing power, influencing governments, selling weapons, justifying militaries and alliances like NATO, not to mention providing lovely destinations with many golf courses and restaurants where occupiers can rule over the lower class locals, feel superior, and build hatred and resentment toward the United States. While no other nations have anything like the 917 foreign bases that the US has, the UK does have 117, so only 800 more to catch up. India has 22. Turkey has 128 in just 10 countries. France has 15 in 10 countries. These are all close US allies and US weapons customers. But Russia has 58 foreign bases in 10 countries, with Syria and Djibouti being the farthest from Russia. We have created map tools similar to the US one for each of these countries so that you can spin the globe and zoom in on each of their bases. Another 12 countries have tiny numbers of foreign bases. In some cases, their only base is in Djibouti, a small nation that seems to have gone out of its way to rent out bases to every possible foreign government for the financial gain of the brutal Djibouti government, but not the people of Djibouti. And certainly not the people of the wider world, which is put at risk of a conflict being sparked by countries like the US and China having bases in the same place. I think the important point here is that it is very, very strange to have foreign military bases. Most countries on Earth do not do it at all. Some do it a tiny bit, but it is basically a US thing, and there is no evidence of any benefit. Bases are part of a global war machine that is dominated by the United States. In the latest numbers on military spending, out of 230 other countries, the US spends more than 227 of them combined. Russia and China spend a combined 21% of what the US and its allies spend on war. Since 1945, the US military has acted in a major or minor way in 74 other nations. Of 230 other countries, the US exports more weaponry than 228 of them combined. Most places with wars manufacture no weapons. Most wars have US weapons on both sides. The US is the leading exporter of weapons to each and every type of government, including the very worst. If bases reduced wars or militarism, this picture would look very different. Here I've added a slide showing US bases in Western Asia. This doesn't show you the ships in the waters, but a US fleet is based in Bahrain. The US is ready for war and amply supplied with targets, attacks on which it could claim simply forced it into a war without any decision or action supposedly being taken. I think we're going to do our own action in a little bit about one of the horrible governments that the United States ships weapons to. On the same webpage as these links to each nation's base map is a link to a map of foreign bases that have been closed, such as Vieques. Closed doesn't necessarily mean cleaned of toxins, poisons, unexploded bombs, and mines. Closed doesn't necessarily mean the land and water will ever recover, but closed is a start. Where we've been able to gather the information, we've included with each base who managed to get it closed, when, and how. The people who do this work need to be honored and thanked for the service. Bases are closed as a result of public pressure, but also as a result of military coups, shifts in military strategies, and various other reasons. So we hope that investigating this data will lead to some usable conclusions regarding getting more bases closed more quickly as well as getting them closed without replacing them with others, and without seeing them reopened when public pressure eases, as we've seen in various locations, such as the Philippines. But it is easier to prevent a base than to close one that's been built. Czechia and Sieniewina in Montenegro are examples. It's also possible to win a half a victory. In Vicenza, Italy, for example, massive public pressure that many of us were part of resulted in unwanted base construction, but of a smaller base than the US government had sought. We have focused on foreign bases because they do harm that domestic ones do not, but domestic military bases do a world of damage as well. Whether or not we ever manage to map them all for various nations, we are aware of many of their results and are working to get them closed where we can. Most of the worst environmental disaster sites in the United States are the creation of the United States' own so-called Defense Department. So you can imagine what the same department is doing in other parts of the world. The lesson that I draw from having worked to oppose bases in several countries while based in Washington, D.C., or in that general area, is that we are stronger when we have solidarity across borders, and in particular, when we're working together, both at the location of a base or a proposed base and at the location of the heart of the empire in Washington. A number of times I've worked with opponents of US bases in distant corners of the globe and watched as they were asked the inevitable question by US Congress members or staffers, namely, well, if you don't want the base there, then where do you want it? And in each case, to their everlasting credit and praise, these good people have responded, we do not want it anywhere. I'll stop there.
Okay. Well, thank you, David. Let's see if we're going to have a question period in just a minute, but first, given what's going on, the horrendous wars going on in the Middle East right now, we're going to have Brian come on and give us an action that we can take to oppose what's happening, especially in Gaza. Brian, can you put up that link?
Thanks, Paul, and I'll do so. As many of you know from our previous webinars, we like to make this very, very easy for you. The folks over at Not Another Bomb and the many groups that make up that coalition have set up an action for us that we have signed on to, and I will put it in the chat right now, the short link, so it's nice and easy for you. All you have to do if you're here in the United States is put in your address. It will automatically look up your senators and your member of the House of Representatives, and you can send them a message telling them that you oppose all future weapons transfers and sales from the United States to Israel, as it not only continues its horrible destruction of Gaza and its oppression of the people of the West Bank, but as it has widened the war north into Lebanon, where they have killed thousands of civilians as well and are now threatening to turn Lebanon into Gaza. Those are the words of Prime Minister Netanyahu. Of course, we know that they are threatening a strike on Iran that could lead to a much broader regional war and involve the United States, perhaps in direct conflict. Your senators will be voting on a $20 billion proposed arms sale to Israel in the next month or so. So we want to get as much advocacy as possible there. In the meantime, tell your representatives that as their constituents, you side with the majority of people in the United States who now oppose further weapons to Israel. One thing that I think has been excellent from this group is the evolution of the demands. Of course, we need a ceasefire. We needed a ceasefire uh, we needed a ceasefire a year ago, but now Israel has shown what it does with U.S. weapons, and the demand is not another bomb. So it's a simple ask, and we ask you to join us in making.
Okay, well, that certainly doesn't take long to send that message, Brian.
I can get it done in about
It's a
30 seconds.
it's a magical system you have there that all of a sudden sneaks these little messages into the offices of our Congress people. So hopefully anyone who feels this way about weapons to Israel will feel comfortable and look forward to pressing that button to send that message. And it goes directly to your senators and to your representative in Congress. So thanks for doing that, everyone. And Ryan, thanks for running that. That's great.
No problem.
So I just let's do this right now. You know, Ken Jones, as I mentioned earlier, is working with a group in Asheville to do the repairs and reconstruction and just helping people survive. And I think the name of the group that he's working with is called Beautiful Asheville or something like that. I think, well, I don't have, I can't find the
I just popped them
website
in
on it.
I just popped them in the chat, Paul. They're right
Great.
there, and they'll be sent in the follow-up email. That organization is called Beloved Asheville.
Beloved Asheville, yeah.
And he also posted their Facebook page, and there you can find more information on how you can help the people of Asheville as they rebuild from Hurricane Helene.
Yeah, so that I think that would be great. We all feel so powerless watching people dealing with this catastrophe. So here's a little bit of a way to help, and knowing that this group actually is right on the ground there, and Ken is working with them tonight to help people get back on their feet. So I would encourage people to look at that website. Okay, let us get back, and if people have any questions for David, would ask you to keep your question to 60 seconds or so. And we know a lot of you have some really good points too, but please keep your comments very short, but please focus on questions if you could. So please, under the React button on the bottom of your screen, choose the raise hand function, and we'll start to call on you. Brian will unmute you so that you can ask your question. So why don't we start with Jeffrey Bachtel.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. First, well, this is part of the question, but if you don't answer the first part, it's rendered mute. This question will be rendered mute. Have you seen the movie Iron Man? First off, it's part of the question. Trust me, because in Iron Man, after Tony Stark saw the devastation that his own weapons caused, he instantly stopped making them. Why don't we do that with the senator, Congress people, and the CEOs of weapons manufacturers, and invite them to places where the weapons have been most devastating. And you see what your weapons have done. Look at all this. What do you think of the idea?
I love the idea. I don't have the slightest capacity to make it real, or maybe I have the slightest, but it's very slight. I mean, you'd like to think that you wouldn't have to physically transport each human being to the site of something in this day and age. The New York Times once ran an op-ed arguing that you should transport every human being to a melting iceberg so that they would know that icebergs were melting. This written by a guy who proudly said he denied the existence of climate change until he himself went to an iceberg. And it seems like sheer idiocy, but when people are denying obvious facts, something has to be done to wake them up. What I think we do have the slightest capacity to do is to take some of the incredibly powerful videos and photos and reports that we now have from someplace like Gaza and send them by the thousands using something like what we just used to email our Congress members, and deliver them in person and put them on giant banners and put them in front of people's houses and offices, and try to get them to see without having to put them on, the private jet we don't own and fly them across the world. I think in just the past week, I've seen a very powerful video consisting largely of films shot by Israeli soldiers themselves and proudly posted on dating websites of all the evils they were doing. I've seen a powerful video purporting to show, ages and ages hence the annual ceremony at the museums around the world commemorating the Gaza genocide. There's no shortage of, well put together photos and videos from all angles of, every horrific war that is currently underway that we could use. But absolutely, if we could get elected officials or war profiteers to do something. I mean, if we could get them to do something, I would get them to, to shut down their companies and to stop shipping weapons and so forth. But if for some bizarre reason we could get them to travel where we wanted and look at what we wanted them to look at, and we couldn't get them to do anything else, then absolutely I would do it. And Congress members take trips to Israel all the time, bought and paid for by Israel. And unless they say something too honest or insist on visiting the wrong places, they get in going on those trips. But get in now to Gaza, this is under the control of Israel. And so it's not going to happen just by snapping my fingers, I'm afraid.
Yeah, well, those are good ideas, though, David. Thank you very much, Jeffrey. Let's take a question from Sharon Leder.
Thank you. Does your organization, any of the ones here, have the capacity to or focus on taking those billions and trillions of dollars that these bases cost and making a suggestion about how they will be better spent? Is that something that any of our organizations currently are doing, to make suggestions like, let's say, a global Marshall Plan or something on that conception?
Yes, of course, as we have a deep moral obligation to be doing, and as many of us have been doing in every way we could imagine for decades, and we have to keep doing. I saw a good TikTok video today from a woman on what you could have bought with the 20-some billion that's been given to Israel by the U.S. government for weapons just in the past year. We have at World Beyond War /3% a plan for what you could do to end starvation in the world with 3% of the U.S. military budget. You could end the lack of clean drinking water everywhere on Earth for a little bit over 1% of the U.S. military budget. You could absolutely transform efforts to slow the collapse of the climate and ecosystems with a fraction of military spending. I mean, it's unfathomable. I mean, it's almost unimaginable for the human brain what you could do with just a fraction of this money. People ask for alternatives, but what could you do instead of the war? What would you do? You must have the war. It's a lack of imagination, and it's a lack of understanding how much stinking money it is, because you could propose bizarre things like, give every person in the opposing army a hotel, because that's how much money it is. And is this why I object to bring our war dollars home, stop giving our money to Ukraine, give it to North Carolina? Because first of all, it's not helping Ukraine, it's destroying Ukraine. And second of all, it's so much darn money that you could spread it around Ukraine, North Carolina, and the entire rest of the earth and have a hard time figuring out what to do with the rest of it. That's how much money it is. We don't have to get selfish about it. We don't have to say spend it here. We ought to say spend it everywhere. We could multiply, the actual US foreign aid budget 100-fold for a fraction of what we're spending to make people hate the United States. And you'd be far safer. It would be a far more effective defense strategy. Nobody has ever attacked anybody for giving them food or medicine. It just hasn't happened, and so, my God, yes, transform the United States, give people something for their money, the way people have in Scandinavia and other parts of the world, although NATO's going after them for it. But you can transform the whole world for the kind of money we're talking about.
Okay, thanks, David. Sharon, you might just check the website of the National Priorities Project. It's been around for quite a while. That gives very concrete ideas of what could be done with just small pieces of that military spending, and just small pieces of just the military spending that goes to sustaining all those bases.
And it gives you trade-offs. It takes the cost of a teacher, and it takes the taxes from your county or your state that go into the military budget, and it calculates how many teachers could you have had instead of your bit of the military budget, which are, it's nice to give people these trade-off statistics.
And our experience is, once you can get people to zero in on the size of the military budget, people have no idea how much is going to the military, really, that people are quite upset. And if you ask them what priorities they would have for spending that same amount of money, they come up with very different decisions than the White House does and Congress. So it's an area that we have been trying to figure out how to communicate about for a long time, and we have to crack this nut so that we can show how totally irrational as well as destructive this type of spending is. So thank you for your question. Let's move to James Manista.
James, you just have to unmute yourself.
Right.
Okay, he did. Yep.
There you are.
What is the nature of our right to occupy any of this land in foreign countries? Do we have a treaty of agreement? Are we on a lease? Are we renting from month to month? Exactly how do we establish that with a view toward enabling us to de-establish it? Who pulls the money away from this occupation? Or are we getting this land gratis because they just love us so much?
Well, I assume you're using we and us and our to refer to the U.S. military, and I would encourage you not to. But I think the answer varies a little bit depending on each location. There are countries, so-called host countries, occupied countries, where, by the way, every government of any of these countries, almost every government, has agreed to have these U.S. bases there, even if the public in these places is overwhelmingly against it. There are places where the local government is, footing a big part of the bill, and there are other places where the U.S. government is writing them a check. Cuba stopped cashing the checks for Guantanamo years and years ago because they never agreed to rent out Guantanamo and didn't want to take, they have a pile of uncashed checks that they're never going to cash because they want their land back. So does the U.S. have Guantanamo by the agreement of the Cubans? No, it has it by the force of its military. In someplace like Diego Garcia, where the U.S. and the British evicted the entire population of an island to turn it into a military base, and the courts keep ruling, including like last week, that it belongs to the original inhabitants. It's not by agreement with anybody there, because there's nobody there except the military base, and it's not through any law. It's just through sheer force, brute force. But in most places, the United States, when the United States built this base in Italy that I said, there was a massive movement to stop, and the people of Italy and the people of the town and the people of the province and the region were adamantly against. The government of Italy had agreed, and the local government had agreed before the public had ever heard of the thing, and in a lot of cases, the U.S. has bases as the result of wars, but it has them through an agreement with the new government following the war. So this is why the U.S. has never left Iraq. And even though there was an agreement that it would, it has refused. And it's not through any acceptance by the Iraqi people or the Iraqi government. The United States just refuses to leave, So in a lot of places like Japan, you have massive protests, get the hell out, but the Japanese government is totally on board, all for it. We want the bases, right? So there's a difference between the people and the government. Whereas in some place like Iraq, even the government says get out, but the U.S. stays, So there's a variety of cases.
Okay, thank you, James. Well, that leads to another question in terms of these bases. One of the justifications, and one thing that makes them popular, is the fact that they do provide jobs in certain countries for people who desperately need jobs. So that makes it more complicated to get rid of these bases, because people will, just sign up for work there. In other countries, they're seen as engines of economic development. How do we deal with those types of objections to closing the bases?
The argument is also made that they provide jobs back in the United States for the weapons dealers and all the subcontractors and so forth. And the argument is made locally that they provide jobs for the locals. But they are just about the least efficient means of providing jobs. They provide jobs that make one, in most cases, a subservient second-class citizen in one's own country. And they do this at the cost of making your locality a target of nuclear and other war making, of stripping you of the right to even know what poisons are going into your water, earth, and soil, strip you of the ability to prosecute people for drunk driving, reckless accidents, rape, and sexual assault, if they are certain people with certain privileges, more equal than everyone else. It's not a cost worth paying, which is why there are, protests by people outside many of these bases without needing to hear any arguments from you and me. They understand the problems created. If the world, if the local government, if the US government actually wanted to create jobs, they would create jobs through, means that would allow people to sleep at night, would not create apartheid states, would not risk horrific destruction and death, and would be many times more efficient at creating better paying jobs. This is, the most awful excuse you ever hear. The US was telling Russia that putting bases on its border with missiles that could hit Moscow in minutes. First, Obama was telling them it was aimed at Iran, of all absurdities. But then they were telling him it was just a jobs program for back in the US. I mean, it's just ridiculous. Congress members believe this crap, in part because some of them are not very intelligent, but mostly because it actually is jobs in their congressional district. And even though they could have more of them and better ones if they would spend money on anything else, they won't spend money on anything else. So it's those jobs or nothing. But there's no reason for the rest of us to believe this stuff.
Yeah.
The studies are from UMass Amherst, as you all know better than I'm sure, that it doesn't make jobs.
Right. Okay, well, thank you, David. Let's go to Cheryl Spencer.
Yes, thank you, David. As always, very well researched and informational talk you've given us. Just to add, the Marshall Islands, which were devastated by the testing of our nuclear weapons in the 50s and 60s, still get money now to allow the ICBM test launch warheads, fake warheads, land near the Marshall Islands. But the people who get that money, I understand, are just kind of the tribal leaders. So the regular people in the Marshall Islands, there are some people who still live there, do not see the money that the US government pays the Marshall Islands to allow it for their warheads. They're testing the ICBMs out of Vandenberg to land there. So that shows you, what might happen to the money that actually the US government is paying out. And the other thing I'd like to mention is regarding jobs. I'm sure you're familiar with the warheads to windmills concept, which is that you could replace these military technology engineering jobs with climate change mitigation jobs. And as so many of our bases are on islands, not very large islands, which are going to have sea level rise covering up the islands. So those islanders would much rather, if the US government's going to give them any money at all, that they work on whatever mitigation they can, mangrove forests and things like that, to stop climate change affecting their smallish islands in the future. So just to say, you could, that's the warheads to windmills concept, is change the type of job to mitigating, finding ways of dealing with sea level rise and other awful effects of climate change. Thank you.
Well, yes, I'm familiar with all of that and couldn't agree more. Thank you. I'm reading a book about the Marshall Islands and other islands called Suburban Empire that seems to be pretty good on this. I do encourage everyone, if they can, to go to Vandenberg with McGregor Eddy and all the protesters who are out there frequently protesting this, war game of pretending you're starting a nuclear war, which of all insanities. This is it, it's a little far to go to Marshall Islands, but if anybody's in California, if you can go to Vandenberg and protest this and stop it. And of course, warheads to windmills is not just a concept. It's also an organization and a book and a website and lobby efforts and online actions and so forth. And so people should get involved and support it.
Yeah, I mean, just think of the COVID epidemic and how completely unprepared most of the world was to deal with it. Here in the United States, what a scandal. We had more people die than in any other country. And so it's a question of national security, how we define it. And somehow we have to twist that definition so that it's a rational definition of national security. Just with all these wildfires and floods and everything else, can you imagine using those resources to create teams of people that are ready to deal with these things immediately? Instead, we just let national security go right down the tubes from Western North Carolina, parts of Florida. It's just so infuriating. But then there is the danger. I wonder, David, if you could comment on the role of these bases in the Middle East if we go to war with Iran. Once Israel retaliates, or I should just say, continues to take the offensive against Iran after assassinating its engineers and political leaders and military leaders and all that. What will be the role of those bases in such a war? And how many of them are in the area? Do you have any idea that would be involved in a war with Iran?
I have a very exact idea if you go to worldbeyondwar.org/bases and zoom in on that part of the world and look at each base. But I'm not sure you can put national and rational together in the same sentence. National is such a source of the irrational. I do think we need, obviously an actual defense strategy that defends against climate collapse and ecosystemic collapse and disease epidemics and poverty and homelessness, and doesn't go around inventing crises with weapons of mass destruction. But I think, the first danger is that these bases and these ships and these troops that the U.S. has just added to in the so-called Middle East are targets. And as soon as one of them is attacked, as soon as you have people who matter dead, because clearly for the U.S. government, there are no people who matter other than U.S. people when the U.S. is interested in a war, or Ukrainian or Israeli people when the U.S. is interested in a war. Then you're going to have the U.S. claim that it's been dragged into a war. There wasn't even a decision made. It was simply war was happening. This is how you're going to get around Congress doing anything, yes, no, or maybe. This is how you're going to get around every Democratic Congress member being on video saying the president can't attack Iran when the president happened to be a Republican. You're going to have the war just be upon us. Israel dragged us into it, or the Hamas attack of October 7th somehow a year later mutated and expanded and dragged us into it, and it was upon us, and there are U.S. troops dead. You must shut up now. There's a war. But I think we have to be prepared to resist that, and to resist it before it happens, and to remember how many times we've prevented a war on Iran. How many times public pressure has been key to preventing a war on Iran. How in 2007, you got the spy agencies to say, no, stop it. There's no Iranian nuclear program. And how the head of the CIA just said the same thing a couple of days ago. Peace activists should be saying, even this guy, is talking sense. I think once there's a war, the place is full of U.S. air bases, U.S. ships, U.S. troops, U.S. bases in joint operation with Israel and Turkey and Jordan. And there's going to be, just catastrophic, beyond anything we've seen this century, killing and destruction. And I'm not sure that isn't what a lot of people in the Israeli government want. It's certainly what they're doing everything they can to create.
Yeah. Yeah, that's for sure. Oh, I see Brian. Brian, you have got a question?
Yeah, I wanted to actually follow up on the first question that came up from Jeffrey Barkdale. He mentioned the movie Iron Man, which was the first in this whole Marvel gargantuan multi-billion-dollar franchise that's become, fortunately or unfortunately, such a big part of our media culture. And he mentioned it is a remarkably anti-war film, but I know that originally it was supposed to be even more so. But the Pentagon intervened, as it so often does, in a way to prevent us from that redefinition of national security that Paul was just talking about. On a previous WIRN webinar, we talked about, you and I talked about how the Pentagon uses its influence in Hollywood to make sure that any anti-war messages are muted or changed into murkiness or even pro-war messaging. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because Iron Man's a good example of it.
Yeah, I had forgotten that example, but it certainly is common for the US military to actually have editorial control over movies. And yeah, it's been a long time if I ever watched the whole thing of Iron Man, but to think that a movie in which I'm assuming I'm right in the impression that, as with almost every other movie, the good guy has to be more violent than the bad guy and the violence wins, that was supposed to be an anti-war movie. It's a very strange notion of anti-war if it's pro-violence, right? If it's
We're grading on a curve here.
right.
We're definitely grading on a curve, Dave.
Right, but this is the problem with, this is why, I like talking with younger people, because the more years people have spent inhaling this stuff that's just in the air around us, that violence is the only solution, the more they find it impossible to imagine that there's any other way. Not have war. What do you mean? Everybody else is going to have war. It's in our genes, and and it's bizarre because we're here in the United States, not just where these movies are produced, but where the U.S. government does war on a whole different scale from any of the governments overseeing the other 96% of humanity who have the same damn genes. And it doesn't make any sense for people to believe that this is normal, this is the only way. But when you show it to them over and over and over again, and when you tell them that the actual wars are similar to the fictional wars, that the Hollywood movie plot lines are how they should think about the actual wars happening to real people in places like Gaza and Lebanon, it's powerful. It's super powerful stuff. And I still can't get over the US public switching in less than a week from nobody knowing where Ukraine was to people stopping me on the street asking me if I support Ukrainian war making, and this is what we're up against. But again, there's powerful footage. The videos and photos from the wars don't lie. This is a live streamed. It's a live streamed genocide in Palestine, and we have to have enough stomach to be willing to keep showing and forwarding the honest videos, because they're more horrible, right? In the Hollywood version, there's endless violence, but you don't see people's organs falling out. You don't see people's limbs across the room. You don't hear the screams. You know, somebody gets a little bloody lip for a minute and it's gone in the next scene. So we have to be able to show people the truth, even though it's hideous.
Yeah. Thank you, David. By the way, that video you mentioned earlier on Gaza is called Atrocity. And you know, some of our friends at the Gray Zone have created it, and it is just incredibly powerful to see that. It is available on the internet for anyone who wants to see it, and it is a must. If there's any question whatsoever that the Israeli goal in Gaza is genocide, if there's the slightest question, this film will remove that doubt from anyone who watches it. So keep that in mind.
I think the film you're talking about, Paul, is one about October 7th and the lies and exaggerations and fictions that the Israeli
No, this is a different, that's right. There's a different one.
Well, this is a good film, Atrocity. Yeah. If you want to look at how they lied about what happened on October 7th and lied and alleged atrocities that then Israel went on to commit itself. So that, you know, it was pretending that Hamas had done all of these hideous things that Israel was about to do and was going to claim it was doing in retribution for Hamas having done it. The reality was hideous enough, but they had to pile on all of these outrageous atrocities because they were about to commit them themselves and have been doing so on an incredible scale. I mean, if you look at this letter that 100 doctors in this country just sent to Biden and Harris about the war in Gaza, that argues very convincingly that the death count of Palestinians is at least 118,000. And you look at the dead on October 7th and otherwise of Israelis, the Israelis are 1.3% at most of the dead, which is significantly more than the US dead in Iraq, which were 0.3% of the dead. But it's an incredibly one-sided slaughter depicted in the US media as, you know, either accidental collateral damage or retribution for the hideous outrage.
Yeah. Yeah, no. Do you remember, David, the name of that other film that I got mixed up with it? The one that actually has the Israeli soldiers talking about how they're going to wipe out people, how Israeli leaders are talking about killing everybody. I mean, it's an unbelievable film.
There was one recently on that theme made by Al Jazeera and featured on Democracy Now, and it ought to be pretty easy to find. I'm sorry.
It's definitely worth keeping an eye out for. Maybe it was an Al Jazeera film. It's getting a little bit late. Maybe Sharon, do you have a follow-on question? And then we'll take the last question from Joe Cabardis.
Muted.
I'm sorry, Brian. Sharon Lettering.
Yeah, okay, I got it. I unmuted myself. You know, I wanted to say that what we're talking about with changing our understanding of national security and the war paradigm that creates cycles of violence and tit-for-tat revenge and escalation. We're really talking about changing it, as you have said, to a peace paradigm. That's one reason I asked the question about what the money can go to. All of this money, it needs to be understood in terms of a different value system. We need to talk about the value of every single life, and that what war does to other people is to dehumanize the other, so you no longer think of what you're doing as even harming another being that has any similarity to yourself. Now, I never served in the military, but I know as an anti-Vietnam War activist back in the day that I knew that people in the military had to dehumanize the other. And that's what happens in your training. And I think that we don't want to repeat that dehumanization here. I think we should look at the Israel-Gaza-Hezbollah situation as an opportunity to change things in the world. The photographs and images that we see, that does capture people's attention. And that was taken on cell phones by people who were present October 7th too. And we need to listen to the voices of the parents who say you cannot measure suffering in terms of dimension. The presence here of Cheryl Spencer is very important in representing WILP, because it's the oldest long-standing women's organization for peace. And we need to, I think, really look at how to take advantage of, in Israel, those grassroots groups that are meeting at great risk, because the government, as you say, is hell-bent on revenge, and they're in trauma. These are people, both people, the Palestinian people and the Jewish people. They've been in the shadow of trauma, and they cannot themselves resolve this. I mean, Netanyahu is delusional if he thinks he's going to kill the ideology of resistance against Israeli oppression. These people are already delusional. So let's take advantage of those resistance movements, resistance to the government of Netanyahu, and resistance to the leadership of extremism, even on the Palestinian side, the suffering that chooses extremism as the only way to capture people's attention. I think that we ought to think about how to make alliance with those groups who supported the hugely popular Tel Aviv protests, who are for a much more moderate government, who want to overthrow Netanyahu, who want to have elections before 2026. I think we need to look at our own system. We have a candidate.
Sharon, let's.
I'm just impassioned because I'm so.
I think those
upset.
are wonderful. Let's just have David see if he has any comments about the strategy that you're talking about.
Thank you.
I agree 100%. I don't know what else there is to say. I always have agreed 100% with every bit of that. I put some related links in the chat, including an award presentation we recently did to a group called Combatants for Peace that's consists of Israelis and Palestinians working together. I don't know.
That's always been a very successful approach in the past during all kinds of other wars, to link up with people in different countries who share the same values, and to build those relationships. So thank you, Sharon. Joe, you have the last question.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, this is good news. I think we should end in a good news. The other day I was reading that the servicing the debt in the United States is more expensive than the military budget. So do you feel that this economic problem of servicing the debt will have its impact on the military? Thank you.
Well, apparently not yet that I've seen. I would love for it to. I can't imagine why it would, but there are millions of things I can't imagine that happen all the time. So I would love for it to. A lot of us have pushed for years and years, move the money from the military to the human needs, move the money from the military to the environmental needs, as if it were a limited pot of money. But every time there's a new war, or there's a disease epidemic, or the billionaires need a break, they just invent trillions of dollars out of nowhere, and it weakens this notion that somehow pressure on the budget in one place is gonna pop up in another place. It doesn't seem to actually be a finite amount of money in any useful, practical, political sense. It seems to be an absolutely unlimited amount of money that goes where the bribery principally and the political pressure very secondarily want it to go. And so you have the New York Times running an article a couple days ago about shooting children in the head routinely in Gaza, bullets made in the United States, I'm sure, and the same day arguing that we're going to have to, take money out of human needs and environmental needs and put them into the military. You've got NATO pressuring countries, especially countries that want to become NATO members or stay NATO members, to take the money out of the environment and out of the human needs and put it into the military. So when they're moving the money in that direction, they talk about it as if it's a finite pie that has to be sliced more in the military side. But when you try to move it back the other way, if you apply enough pressure, you get more money for some of the decent things you want. But the military money stays just as high as it was, at least in recent decades. And so I think we have to educate people, as we've always tried to do, about how much money it is and where it's going and how useful it would be to move it, as well as how useful it would be to stop giving it all to billionaires, to have corporations and the super wealthy pay taxes and so forth. But for the most part in US politics, the people who change the subject to the debt are almost always people who don't want you to notice how much money's going into the military and don't want to talk about that. They want to talk about the debt instead. So it's unusual. It's rare for me in a peace conversation to be talking about the debt. But if there's a way to make the debt be a useful tool for peace, I'm all for it.
Okay, thanks, Joe. We'll work on that, Joe. So David, thank you so much for being with us and for your ideas tonight. Just call attention, remind people of the website that David showed us tonight, showing where the different bases are located and helping us to find out what goes on at each of those bases to keep ourselves on top of the research. So we should all check that from time to time to see what's going on, especially as these crises come up in different parts of the world. We can see what bases are there. And obviously the NATO bases in Europe are incredibly important now in terms of the increasing danger of nuclear war over US policy in Ukraine. Okay, so thanks everybody. I really appreciate it. Keep us in mind for the November event. We're going to be sending out a recording of this webinar the end of the week. Actually, I guess tomorrow is the end of the week. And we'll be sending out a few other links to a few other resources, including that group that's working in Western North Carolina to help rebuild. David, thanks a million. Thanks so much for all your work. Keep us informed, and let's see what we can accomplish together, okay?
Sounds great.
Good night, everyone.